Okay, let's dive right into an explainer that is going to completely transform everything you think you know about England's most terrifying historic sites. We are throwing out the cheap jump scares, the amateur ghost hunting blogs, and those little noises in the dark that usually just turn out to be a settling pipe. Today, we're looking exclusively at the hard, documented facts. We are exploring locations that truly challenge our understanding of reality, places where human grief and profound violence seem to have literally settled right into the stone. Now, what's really fascinating about this specific quote is how perfectly it captures the professional dread we're exploring today. Think about it. We're talking about teams of experts, people who have spent decades walking through flooded Victorian asylums and medieval dungeons with absolute detachment. But in the locations we're about to cover, these seasoned professionals suddenly put down their gear and walk away. And often they can't even fully explain why. This same kind of unexplainable dread builds up to a deeply researched Roman anomaly in York that we'll uncover a bit later, which researchers still simply cannot explain away. So we're going to break this down through a structured escalation of evidence. We'll start with the professional's dread, move into atmospheric anomalies, explore what's actually documented on the record, uncover some grim physical truths, analyze a historically impossible sighting, and finally talk about the heavy weight of history. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the professional's dread when the experts walk out. Let's look at the specific places that make those seasoned professionals pack up their bags and just leave. Woodchester Mansion is completely fascinating because it has been sitting totally empty for 150 years. Construction just stopped dead in 1873 when the wealthy owner William Lee died. The stonemasons put down their tools and literally nobody ever finished it. Yet multiple independent teams report this distinct, overwhelming sensation of being watched by something that has already decided if they're welcome or not. In 2012, an investigation abruptly ended when a team member's chair moved on camera in a completely sealed, draftless room. The investigators just noted it in the report and left. That specific kind of professional composure actually tells you quite a lot about the intense atmosphere there. And this brilliantly illustrates the quiet, creeping dread at Ham House. Built back in 1610, it was fiercely ruled by the Duchess of Lauderdale, right up until her death in 1698. Today, investigators don't report chaos. They just feel this freezing cold displacement of air near her former bedchamber. Visitors even report hearing and sometimes feeling the patter of a small spaniel dog in the long gallery. The catch? Absolutely no dogs are permitted. Professional teams frequently report feeling like they've arrived somewhere without an invitation, kind of like stepping into a room where everyone stops talking and just stares at the door. Moving right along to Section 2, atmospheric and daylight anomalies. Because it turns out these events don't just happen in the pitch dark or to amateur thrill seekers trying to spook themselves. So, the absolutely crucial point here is that this isn't some fringe paranormal blog making wild claims about Barry Pomeroy Castle. This is English Heritage, the highly prestigious official organization responsible for maintaining England's most significant historic sites, actually puts this in their official visitor materials. They openly acknowledge it. And the numbers here completely subvert our expectations. A whopping 80% of the sightings of the famed Blue Lady happen in broad daylight. We're talking about clear weather, right in the middle of the afternoon, happening to everyday people who simply came to admire the architecture. It completely challenges that stereotypical narrative of things only going bump in the night. Let's move to Section 3, documented on the record. This is where we see how mere atmosphere builds into physical evidence that the public simply couldn't ignore. Tracing this history from 1726 to 1936 shows how a whispered family tragedy escalated into the most closely examined ghost photograph in British history. Dorothy Walpole died in 1726. Officially, it was smallpox, but local rumors insisted her husband locked her away. Fast forward to 1936. Two photographers from Country Life magazine capture a translucent, descending figure right on the staircase. What makes this extraordinary is that Kodak, yes, that Kodak, formally examined the original negative and verified it had never been double exposed or tampered with. To this day, no mechanical explanation has ever been produced. The sheer scale of the public panic at Highgate Cemetery is just staggering. What started as local folklore and a few quirky letters to a newspaper sparked an actual ITV broadcast in 1970. This broadcast whipped people into such an absolute frenzy that a massive real-world mob literally swarmed over the cemetery gates in the dead of night, physically fighting past the police to haunt a supposed vampire. It even led to charred remains being discovered and multiple arrests. It's incredible proof of how these specific locations can literally alter modern history and drive mass public behavior. Sometimes, the repetition itself becomes the evidence. Take Blickling Hall, Anne Boleyn's childhood home. A grim tradition has persisted there ever since her execution on May 19, 1536. Every single year on that exact date, sightings are reported on the approach road. Highly credible institutions like the National Trust quietly acknowledge this, fully knowing that locals are going to gather at the gates every May. That is 500 years of continuous history, all tied to a queen executed on fabricated charges. Now, things escalate pretty drastically in Section 4, physical truths and violence. This is where the horror isn't just a shadow, it's literally buried in the walls. Borley Rectory was once dubbed the most famous haunted house in England. The prominent investigator Harry Price turned it into an international sensation. But later, he was thoroughly exposed for fabricating evidence, literally caught with pockets full of stones to throw. You'd think that would be the end of the story, right? Case closed. But the physical truth of the site refused to be contained by a hoax, because in 1943, a real young woman's skull was actually excavated from the cellar of this completely debunked house. 50. That is the number of years a man named John Humphreys lived entirely alone at the ancient Ram Inn. He bought it in 1968, and eventually his wife and daughter left, but he stayed for 50 years, in a building sitting directly atop a 5,000-year-old pagan burial ground. When he finally excavated the basement floor, he found the skeletons of children, with broken pieces of metal knives still inside the remains. Experts confirmed it was entirely consistent with ritual sacrifice. When you get past the sterile historical facts, the terror at Chillingham Castle feels deeply cold and very real. It isn't scary because of rumors, it's terrifying because of what is heavily documented on the record. The resident torturer, John Sage, executed over 1,000 people here. Prisoners were burned alive in the courtyard. During renovations of the infamous Pink Room, the skeletal remains of a young boy were found inside a solid wall, and the tragic condition of his hands showed he had been walled in alive, trying to scratch his way out. Paranormal teams don't just find a ghost here. They find a sustained, heavy presence of documented, unspeakable trauma. It's no wonder many flat-out refuse to ever return. Which brings us to the climax, the mystery box we opened at the very start of our explainer. Section 5, the historically impossible sighting, and a story that completely rewrote archaeological assumptions. I want you to imagine being an 18-year-old apprentice plumber in 1953, working entirely alone in a dim cellar in York. Harry Martindale had been down there for 4 hours when he suddenly heard a single trumpet note echoing from inside the stone. Then, a Roman soldier stepped straight out of the solid wall, followed by a cart horse, and then 20 more soldiers marching in pairs. Because they were walking on the original Roman road buried about a foot below the modern cellar floor, they appeared only from the knees up until they reached a lower excavated section of the room. The specific details of this sighting are the undeniable proof of why this case is so legendary. When Harry ran upstairs absolutely terrified, military historians initially mocked him. Why? Well, because the Roman soldiers of that era, the ones drawn in every 1953 history textbook, carried large rectangular shields and wore standard rigid armor. But Harry vehemently insisted he saw round shields, green tunics, and very specific open sandals strapped all the way up to the knee. It didn't match the standard Roman garrison profile of the time at all. But decades later, local excavations uncovered the stunning truth. It was definitively confirmed that a later 4th century auxiliary unit was indeed stationed in York, and they were equipped exactly as Martindale had described. It is a historically impossible anomaly. An 18-year-old plumber in 1953 had absolutely zero academic way of knowing the precise, undocumented uniform of a 4th century auxiliary unit that wouldn't even be verified by archaeologists until much, much later. Harry told this exact story for 60 years, never changing a single detail and never accepting a dime for it. Which brings us to our final takeaway for today, Section 6, the weight of history. What exactly is happening in these ancient English buildings, and how on earth do we make sense of all this? I think we need to redefine the premise entirely. None of these stories are really about ghosts in the traditional pop culture sense. They are physical locations where human grief, profound shock, and violence settled into the stone and simply refused to leave. When 100 deaths happen in a single courtyard, or a life is tragically walled in, that heavy historical weight doesn't just evaporate when the people move on. It stays.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought from our source material today. The next time you visit a heritage site, stop for just a second. Before you read a single plaque, before you look at the exhibits, just pay close attention to the atmosphere. Does the building feel like it was expecting you? Because as we've seen from the seasoned professionals who have fled them, some of these buildings will make you really wish it did.